You are listening to Social Europe podcast. We discuss cutting-edge thinking on politics, economy, and employment and labour with some of the most thought-provoking people around, including Nobel Prize winners and other internationally acclaimed experts. So welcome and enjoy the conversation.
Today our topic is inequality in Europe and what can be done about it. As always, I'm joined by a panel of experts and politicians. Today, in particular by Lorenza Antonucci from Teeside University, Michael Dauderstädt, formerly of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation in Germany and now a consultant in the area of inequality. And to my left, the MEP from Barcelona, Javi Lopez, who is also the rapporteur for report on inequality in the European Parliament. And later on, we're going to be joined by the Vice President of the S&D Group, Bullmann. So, Lorenza, let me start with you.
Okay.
You do research on social policy. What do you think are the most pressing issues when it comes to inequality in Europe?
I think that what's happening right now in Europe is what I call a reconfiguration of the welfare mixes. And for that, I mean that people have less state resources to start with because of process of austerity, which affected the different welfare states. They also get less resources from the labor market because of increasing precarity in the labor market, which means that finally they get more resources from the family, which is becoming the last resort of welfare support. And this is a process which creates inequality because fundamentally it's a transmission of inequality across families. It's a process that I analyze in my research on young people, but it's happening across the spectrum also for other sectors of the society. Another thing that I've analyzed in my research is how this is affecting the political sphere. So we have done research on the relationship between inequality and Brexit, and we found that actually what's happening is that there's a declining level of support for traditional politics due to the fact that people feel more insecure and also that they have less economic resources. This is not affecting just marginalized parts of the population, so the working class, but it's affecting also intermediate groups, so the so-called squeeze middle. So what's happening is that there's this intermediate group which represents the ordinary people, which is slowly declining to the bottom due to increasing level of risk and having less resources, as I said before, because of the reconfiguration of the welfare mixes. And in terms of inequality in Europe, one last thing that I would add is that there is a process of restructuring of national policies, which is triggered by European EU initiatives, such as the role that the European semester played since 2008, an increasing level of influence that the European semester has on the welfare state, national welfare states. And unfortunately, this process, which potentially could be good to reform the EU in the direction of decreasing inequality, well, unfortunately, this process has been very much in the direction of reinforcing inequality because lots of reforms that have been implemented towards the semester were led by parts of the Commission, like the ECFIN, which didn't believe that inequality was a problem as such. And even recently, with the creation of the pillar of social rights, I think there's an understanding of the social field which is separated from the economic field. So I think this artificial separation between the economic and the social makes really hard for us to tackle inequality. So one of the priority, I would say, in terms of the politics of the inequality would be to try to modify a bit the semester, try to add more elements that tend to decrease inequality.
You mentioned an interesting point by saying that there is a relationship between the Brexit vote and inequality. Do you think this is isolated for Brexit, or is there a general relationship between populism and inequality? What do you think?
Well, from the research we're doing, it's still in process because we're lucky that we are now having the really long term of elections across Europe, so we will be able to say something more about it, I think, in the next few months. But what we are already finding with our research is that it's this decline of traditional politics is general in Europe, as we know, and these are common patterns. So in Brexit, it got obviously it got represented in a very direct way because it was a referendum. But we can see the manifestation of this in the forthcoming and the past, election rounds, like in the Dutch elections, in the French elections. You see that traditional parties do not perform well. So there is really an increasing dissatisfaction with traditional politics, with both the center right and the center left, and this is due to people increasing level of dissatisfaction with the economy and feeling that they have lost since especially 2008. So you can see really that if you ask people, do you think that your personal position has worsened in the last 5 years, they would say yes. And therefore, this is reflected also in how they go to vote.
Okay, so we haven't done the full research yet, but the hypothesis is there might well be the case that there is a relationship between populism and inequality.
Yes, we are obviously in process of analyzing that, yeah.
Okay. Michael, may I come to you? You've done a lot of empirical research on inequality, and if somebody asks you what are the sort of 3 to 4 most pressing inequality-related issues in Europe, what would you say?
Well, if you talk about inequality in Europe, we have to differentiate between different dimensions. There's one, the inequality within countries. That's mostly what you were talking about, which is affected by European policies to some extent. And then the inequality between countries, between member states, which is also affected by European policies. Actually, the European treaties foresee as a goal of European integration that the income levels should converge to some extent. There is a lot of talk about cohesion and convergence, perhaps more on the regional level than on the country level, but it's still clear in the treaties and in other EU documents. How did these things develop? Well, inequality within countries has increased in many countries over the last decades, one has to say. Actually, the process is a little bit decelerating. It depends on the country. For instance, Germany is a country which has been experienced a strong increase in inequality in the early 2000s, between 2000 and 2010 or so, and now it's a little bit more stabilizing. Other countries are much more worrying. And the absolute levels of inequality on a national level are quite different. For instance, the Czech Republic is a rather egalitarian country. One of the most unequal countries is Spain. Now, inequality between countries, there we have a relatively good record by the European integration over the last 20 years or so. Actually, since preparing and joining the EU, preparing for entry and joining the EU, the new member states of Central Eastern Europe have experienced a relatively strong growth. Their growth rates were much higher than the growth rates of the traditional northwestern core of Europe, like Scandinavia, UK, Germany, and so on. And that has led to a kind of convergence of income. The problem is that this strong growth of the poor economies has only partially compensated the increase of inequality within countries. So if you try to calculate an EU-wide inequality indicator, that's what I did, you have the picture that inequality has declined until about the crisis 2008, then a little bit increased, and is now, since about 4 or 5 years, relatively stable. If you use as an indicator the so-called S80-S20 ratio, which is the relationship between the income of the richest 20% to the poorest 20%. That is on the EU level about 6 at purchasing power parities and 9 at exchange rates. At purchasing power parities, the inequality is usually lower, because the purchasing power of income in poor countries is higher. This development is, well, it's not good news because in former times we had a decline of inequality, but it's not so bad because it's at least stable. On the other hand, one has to see that this stability of the relative inequality hides an increase of absolute inequality in the terms of differences of income. So if we compare average income of the poorest countries or the poorest parts of a country with the richest ones, or if we compare wages in Romania with wages in Luxembourg, or if we compare minimum wages in Romania with minimum wages in Luxembourg, we get terrible disparities. It's a ratio of 1 to 50 or something like that, which is, of course, a reason for people to migrate from poor countries to rich countries. And then we come again to the questions of populism. I think when we are talking about Brexit, the issue of migration from Eastern Europe into the UK was one of the salient issues in the campaign. And I think also that the loss of jobs through relocation of production from high-wage countries to low-wage countries has also been an issue. The kind of deindustrialization, the decline of the traditional blue-collar working class in high-wage countries, all this is part of the complex which leads to the rise of populism.
Mm-hmm. Javi, may I come to you? We've now heard a lot of arguments from our researchers, what they found in their inquiries. Coming to you as a policymaker, what can you do about it?
Well, we should do more and better, no? Especially we have to rethink our welfare state, because our welfare state, it was like the model, the way to reduce inequalities that we built in Europe the 20th century. But coming back to some questions, I would like to say, well, first of all, we learned the last years that inequalities is not a problem only about social affairs. It's a problem with the institutional stability, and this talks about extremism and populism, especially these new movements that we have. And also we learned that we have an economic problem with inequalities. Our potential growth could be damaged by these high inequalities that we feel in Europe, no? And the EU has to rethink their goals in this field, because we had in the last years in our socioeconomic roadmaps, like 2020 agenda, like Lisbon. Well, we try to fight against poverty. We have in the treaties the convergence. I know the fight against poverty and convergence, they are linked with fight against inequality, but it's not the same. It's not exactly the same. And then the European Parliament has the opportunity to put on the agenda the fight against inequality as a goal of the European Union.
Mm-hmm. And Udo has just joined us. Welcome. And no problem. And may I ask the next question to you? What do you think are the most important political initiatives that are necessary in order to tackle the inequality issue that we face in Europe, or the many dimensions of the inequality issue we face in Europe?
I, first of all, would like to underline that, and this was already Javi's point, we have to be fully aware and publicly admit that inequality is not only a feature of how we could describe our society sociologically, but this is a poison to the development of our value-based society. This has to be a part of our awareness, political awareness, so that we organize a sense of readiness for change. I think political will is the main obstacle, political will is the main hurdle of not improving the situation. And once that is done, we can talk strategies, we can talk certain measures, we can talk initiatives. We have a whole lot of good papers of how to improve. On paper, I can describe, the Commission can describe, everybody can describe what is to be done. Look at, for instance, the so-called Lisbon strategy. We, at the beginning of the century already, described what to be done against child poverty, young people leaving schools too early, etc., etc. So on paper, we are fine. But the implementation of our policy programs, that is lacking. And here I can tell you that in our everyday work in the European Parliament, we find a huge difference in the treatment of different policy areas when it comes to fiscal rules, when it comes to restrictive fiscal obligations on national budgets. Here we are totally tough. Whereas when it comes to the fight against youth unemployment, when it comes to the fight against poverty in our societies, we are more or less relaxed and we are having a lot of talk, cheap talk. This is my main problem.
And what exactly, very easy question, what exactly do you think needs to change so we can move from writing the papers to implementing the papers?
That's very easy. We have, for instance, I tell you, on the basis of the given fiscal rules, we have a Stability and Growth Pact, which is stupid enough and cannot distinguish between a national player, which, for instance, after a national election, gives thousands of jobs in its top positions of state corporations to family members, and a state actor which effectively fights youth unemployment. And my proposal would be, for instance, to say we have to distinguish on public expenses whether they are qualified public expenses or whether they are not qualified public expenses, and encourage member states to do something useful with the taxpayers' monies. Those countries which modernize, those countries who invest themselves in the fight against poverty, in the fight against unemployment, they have to be honored and they deserve support. Whereas countries who invest in their past, bureaucratic past, I would not dare to support this kind of strategy. But we have to modernize our schemes of intervention to make them more intelligent, more modern, and more sustainable.
Mm-hmm. And Lorenza, if I can come back to you. Michael already mentioned that there are many dimensions of inequality, not just within states and between states, but also in completely different life areas. Especially if you look at potential generational conflicts between the interests of young people and older people, and as well as a topic that we discussed this morning already, health inequalities. And because you have the shocking circumstances that within a very narrow space, you actually have very, very different life expectancies. So, you know, when you come to these kind of elements, what kind of policies would you like to see to address these?
One of the things we discussed this morning is that the European Commission white paper, for example, mentions inequality only in relation to intergenerational inequality. They don't accept or acknowledge the existence of intragenerational inequality, which I think is a problem, especially for young people. So this idea that young people are not all the same, the rising level of unemployment and precarity is actually reinforcing intragenerational inequalities because young people are using and mobilizing more family support in order to go through precarious labor market transitions. And therefore, very simply, the young people which come from wealthy families would have it better, would have smoother transition through the labor market. And I think what sort of the neoliberal discourse, I wouldn't even call neoliberal, but the common discourse when addressing these issues is thinking that we need to cut the welfare state to address the generational imbalances, where actually it's the opposite. It's the is the fact that the welfare state is being privatized so much in the last 20, 30 years, which makes this generation of young people suffering from the lack of state support. So I think intergenerational inequality and the challenges that are facing young people should go together. So first of all, we should really talk about intergenerational inequality as a manifestation of spreading level inequalities between people which have different resources. So you can call it class inequalities, or you can just address it as wealth, differences in wealth, resources, and income resources. And the other thing I think we should do, and in relation also to what you just said, is the European semester, working again on what I mentioned before in the European semester, because in terms of implementation, that's a really powerful tool to implement reforms. Not a tool which is at the hands of the European Parliament at the moment, and that's a part of the problem. There should be a discussion on why the European semester, which is implemented the Growth Stability Pact, is given to the hands of the executive, just the executive. So there is no actually feedback from the electorate, from the citizens. And it's the most powerful instrument. It's the instrument which is having most effect on citizens' lives, because the reforms that are implemented through the European semester are very carefully checked by the Commission. There are missions in the member states, and they've been very profound, especially in Southern European countries. So we know that the EU can actually change policies now. So since 2008, paradoxically, the EU has become way more powerful in changing policies. The problem is that they're changing policies in a direction, the economic direction, not taking into account the link between the economic policies and this rising level of inequality we're talking about. So I think one direction should be integrating the economic policies with the social policies. The new initiative of the European Social Pillar and the Social Scorecard create almost like an add-on to a procedure which is really strong on the economic. We need more than that. We need to change the way we talk about economic policies in the Commission. And part of that, I think, it's asking for other DGs to enter into the debate, to the Parliament to enter into the debate, and also for the Commission to be more in touch with the discourse that is going on in academia, because there are many proposals and many different ways of looking at inequality. And it seems to me when I read the Commission papers that they're a bit stuck in what the debate was before the crisis.
Mm-hmm. I mean, Michael, Lorenza seems to advocate a more integrated and comprehensive approach to inequality. And are issues such as health inequality maybe only a function of underlying issues that, the root cause is somewhere else? Or what kind of integrated strategy would you propose in order to tackle this?
Well, I think health inequality is probably very much correlated with income inequality. In Germany, you can see that very clearly that richer people have a higher life expectancy than poorer people. Privately insured people are better treated and quicker treated than people who have just the usual legal health insurance. But I think in the end, from my point of view, we should really focus on income inequality, and of course we can do a lot improving welfare systems like health, like education, for instance, because actually access to public goods and services is part of the income, which is usually not calculated within the statistics, but it could be and possibly should be, and it would show that actually it would improve income, it would reduce income inequality, it would improve the distributional figures, because it's like the difference between market income inequality and disposable income inequality. When you take into account taxes and transfers, inequality gets lower. And if you take into account access to public goods and services, again, it gets lower. But often our welfare systems are not really focused on reducing income inequality. They are more oriented towards maintaining a certain income status, like the German pension system, for instance. I think the most pressing issues or most promising policies are tax policies. I think wealth tax, inheritance tax, top tax rates for high incomes, all these things we should, to some extent, go back to the levels these taxes had in the 50s, 60s and 70s. If we look at the US, still at the time of Ronald Reagan, income taxes were much, much higher than today. And these were times when economic growth was not bad at all. So one cannot say that high taxes prevent good economic growth. That is, I think, one thing. The other thing is, of course, the labor market. It's good that Germany introduced finally a minimum wage, and I think these kind of minimum wages we should have within Europe. Of course, not a single European minimum wage, because the purchasing power parities are different, the productivity levels are different, but a minimum wage which is a kind of common floor, or let's say a minimum wage which is linked to the GDP per capita. Let's say it should be about 50% of the average wage or something like that. And because there are huge differences between European countries in this regard. And I think this kind of regulation, which takes care that wages increase with GDP, that with productivity, that is an important thing. Again, there have been countries, especially I have to say Germany, where wages for a long time have increased much less than productivity. The wage share has declined, real wages have stagnated, and that has led or was part of the phenomenon that Germany runs an enormous export surplus, because people are not consuming so much as they possibly would if they had higher wages.
And let me come again to our policymakers. I mean, I'd like to pick up your idea of a sort of broader view and integrated strategy against inequality. What, in political terms, can be done? I mean, how can, for instance, Lorenza's idea of broadening the remit of the European semester and sort of strengthening the social element, the social analysis part of it, what can actually be done on the European level to sort of change the mechanics so that this broader view can be implemented?
Well, I think we could do two different things. On one hand, we can build a real social policy in the EU. Like we are talking about the European social pillar. This is a nice idea, but it's a list of recommendations, basically. We will have some rules, but if we will want a real social pillar, that it's a real common floor, social floor, for salaries, but not only for salaries, even for services or rights in the labor market, we need rules. Second, institutions like policies, programs. Third, resources. This is the three elements that we should have in a real social policy in the EU, a real European social pillar. But on the other hand, this is not enough. This is clearly not enough, because if we don't link the social dimension to the semester, it was really well explained that the semester is a really hardcore machine with really capability to enforce the member states to have really mandatory lines in our budgets and in our reforms, national budgets and national reforms. We will fail, as we see with the recommendations of the Lisbon Agenda or the 2020 objectives against poverty. And then we have a macroeconomic imbalance procedure. This is really hardcore procedure. And we have a scoreboard with deficits and so on, with macroeconomic lines. We should put at the same level and coordinate our socioeconomic goals. Inequality should be one of these, but not only, like our poverty. We talk about unemployment, or this is a real imbalance. No, it's true that we should be capable to stabilize our national budgets. No, and this is a real unbalance. No, to have a too much deficit, but it's at the same time to have 25% of unemployment that we had in Spain 4 years ago. And then coordinate our social objectives with our macroeconomic objectives that should be, and it was said also, should be less aggressive in terms of fiscal consolidation that we saw in the period 2010 to 2015. We are changing this. I think he is one of the protagonists that are pushing to this change. But this is the point to do these two sides. At the same time, we should don't forget that the social welfare state is basically in our national member states. And we could do a lot in our national member states because we thought our national welfare states with the Beveridge report, after with the first Labour government in United Kingdom after the Second World War, like pensions, transfers, healthcare, education. This was more or less the program for 75 years, 40 years for the left wing, for the socialist parties. But the point is, with these huge inequalities, this is not enough. And probably we need new tools. Probably we have to think in the new social risks that we have, because we have the society is different. We have monoparental families. We have another world. After these 75 years, another economy, deglobalization, rebuilt to have a more effective redistribution and more fair distribution, and to have impact in the distribution, because this is one of the main problems that we have. We have these inequalities because the distribution is so unequal.
Mm-hmm. And Udo, the same question goes to you. What could be the elements of an integrated strategy that links the European level with the national level and can have some oomph?
I think Lorenza is completely right when she argues for a holistic approach, a holistic policy approach, and for a multi-level strategy, including various actors from the European level till the regions, not only the member states, but all the regional level. Small example, year 2002, Spring Summit in Barcelona. Heads of state and government decided that each and any young man or woman leaving school should be offered a decent job or a relevant trainee scheme after 3 months. It was the second time that we decided on that. The first time was 1996, when the employment strategy was founded in Luxembourg, under the Luxembourgian presidency. I have no clue how often we decided on the same plan again without doing it. So we are in an area of what experts call soft law procedure, where your sharpest instrument is the peer review. Unlike the Stability and Growth Pact, where you have concrete sanctions, you are in the middle of nowhere. So you have the peer review, you have the new declaration, you have the proposal by the Commission, and what is going to happen if you do not fulfill the criteria? Nothing. What we have to alter is that we more and more develop towards binding rules. Binding rules, as you have it in the fiscal policy area as well. Binding rules on the development of environmental goals, sustainability, social goals, positive economic goals when it comes to creating jobs and fair employment and decent employment. How can that be done? We have to change the semester procedure to become a more serious exercise. We need, if you ask me, sanctions and incentives, and we need parliamentary scrutiny. Only if there is a concrete control by parliamentarians, and parliamentarians are more than today. We have a certain say in the discussion. We do reports, we have a certain procedure of accepting guidelines and recommendations. But we have to be part of the game. Otherwise, we will not come into a constellation where we indeed seriously follow up to what was the recommendation of the Commission.
So maybe then the country-specific recommendation might look quite different in the future. I have yet to see one that says increase the minimum wage or something like that. But I'm afraid this is all we have time for today. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you very much for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you don't miss future episodes by subscribing to Social Europe Podcast. You can also read our articles on www.socialeurope.eu and follow us on Facebook and on Twitter @Social Europe. Until next time.